Hello and welcome to Module 4 of the Perl workshop. In this module we'll be talking about loops. The idea behind loops in programming is to be able to do an operation multiple times without having to hard code in however many times you want to do it. So for instance, you could want to perform an operation 1,000 times, but in order to do that without loops, you'd have to write that statement 1,000 times in your code. So to bypass that, there are loops that will do that for you if you do it properly. So we're going to learn how to do it properly. So I'm going to start, there's two types of loops that we'll talk about. There's a while loop and a for loop, and I'm going to start with a while loop. The basic structure of a while loop is here in a comment. There'll be an initialization step, and then you'll have your while, and you'll have your Boolean condition, your Boolean statement. We talked about these last time when we talked about if statements. So Boolean statement's either going to be true or false. So while this statement is true, you want to do something, and then you're going to have an update statement. And we'll go over these in more detail. So here's a basic example. In this example, we initialize a variable I to be 0, and we say while that variable I is less than 10, we want to print the value of I. So we say I equals the value of I. And then we update the value of I by adding 1 to it. So this is just typical, and this should print out I is equal to 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on until we get to 9, which is the last value that is strictly less than 10. So if we run this, this is in lesson 4.perl, and the link to this lesson is below in the comments. So if you're following along, let's execute this and see what happens. And it's exactly what we thought would happen. We get I equals 0 all the way to I equals 9. So that's the basic idea of a while loop. So then we can move on to for loops. So let me comment this section up. And let me uncomment this first for loop. So this is the basic structure of a for loop. You have the same basic components as a while loop, and in fact anything that you can do, practically anything that you want to do with a while loop, you can also do with a for loop, and vice versa. So it's really preference, and well, there are also situations where you want to use one or the other, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So this is the basic structure. You say for, and then you have your initialization step, and then a semicolon, your Boolean statement, a semicolon, and then your update statement. And if you notice, those are the exact same components that were in the while loop before. And inside curly brackets, you're going to tell it what you want to do. So here's an example that will do the exact same thing as we did above with the while loop, or at least it should. We have our initialization where we initialize a variable to 0, and then we say our condition is that we want this variable, as long as this variable is less than 10, we're going to increment it by 1, and then we're going to execute. And so this may seem a little bit, the while statement may seem a little bit more intuitive to you, so you may want to use that instead. This gets a little bit complicated for some people, but you can see in practice how it's used and that it turns out to be the exact same thing. So I will save this and execute. And again, we get the same thing, same output. Okay, so one thing I did want to mention is that sometimes, a lot of time, if you're reading other people's code, you'll probably come across an if statement that or a for loop rather, that looks a little bit more like this. And it's the exact same thing as the one above, and the only difference is this update statement. So here it's a very clean update statement. You take the variable I and you set it equal to itself plus 1. And in here we just have I++. These are identical. This is just shorthand for this statement. So just keep that in mind. And if we save this and we run it again, we get the exact same output. So it does the exact same thing. This is just shorthand for this. So just be aware of that. So next, I want to just go a little bit more of how for loops and while loops can be used, what's their purpose. And one good thing about for loops and while loops, one thing that makes them very useful is their ability to iterate through strings and arrays. So I wanted to give you an example of both. So first we're going to look at this string. And so I just have a short little burst of nucleotides here. And so I capture its length. And I want to ask the question, where are the t's? So I want to find the index of all the t's in my, my sequence. Straightforward question, but if you think about it, it would be very difficult to do this on a large scale. With if statements, you certainly could. You certainly could look at each substring, each character, if this character is t, if this character, but you can see how that would get tedious. So we're going to find a more automated way of doing it, and we're going to do it with for loop. So I chose for loop for this one. Of course, you could use while. But so I start my I at 0, and I want to walk all the way through the length. So in this case, it will be 5. So this is really 5. And then I want to increment my counter as I go. So if you watch the last, or I've rather 2 lessons before, module 2, you'll know all about this substring. And for those of you who didn't, let me refresh. So substring will take in a string and an index and a length. And so it will return, in this case it will return, since I have indicated my length to be 1, it will return a single character at the index I. So I is going to start at 0, so I will grab that first element, and then it'll be incremented, and I'll grab the second element, and so on and so forth. Now, at each step, at each iteration of the for loop, I want to check and see if I have a t. So in here I use if statement. We talked about if statements last time. And I can say if this character is equal, EQ, remember for strings, to t, then we print there is a t located at I. So this should give us, in our test string, this first t is at 1 and this t is at 4. So let's see if that's what we get. Okay, cool. That's what we get. So there's just one way that you can use a for loop for hopefully a more interesting problem. Now my second example in this part is we're going to be using a while loop. Let's comment this. And we're going to be iterating through an array. Okay. So I have an array now, and I have A, T, C, G, N, A, T. And I want to print all of the elements until I find an N. And at that point, I don't want to print any more. So this could be my stop character. I want to print everything before it, but I don't want to print anything after it. And in this case, it's a good example to use a while loop because you don't necessarily know where that N is going to go, again, is going to be. So in a really long sequence, it could be, at the thousandth spot, and you wouldn't necessarily know that. So you just want to say, while I'm not seeing an N, print my elements. You don't necessarily want to say for until this because you don't know where you're going. So it's a good example of using a while loop. You could also use a for loop, but my inclination here is to use a while. So we start with our initialization. If you have noticed, I like using I. To me, it makes sense because I'm looking for indices. So I use I, but you can use any variable you want. This doesn't necessarily have to be an I. So I say while array, this is my array, and I've named it ARR. So now if you remember from our first module, to get one element of an array, instead of this @ sign, you use the $sign, and you give it the name of the array, and in brackets you give it the index in which you want to draw from. So while element I is not equal to n, I want to print the element, and then I want to update it to move on to the next element. So let's see what this does. Okay, so we have the element, we have A, T, C, G, and that's what we wanted, because then we hit an n and we don't want to print anything out after the n. So there's another useful example of something you can do with a while loop. Now lastly, I wanted to go over a few exercises in really mastering these while and for loops. And I think these are really good exercises. Oh, well, I guess I just have one. And again, I want to make sure to let you guys know, if you want a specific example done, you can either contact me through the comments and ask for the specific thing that you need help on. And I'd be happy to help you out, either by making another video or by contacting you personally and helping you out. But I thought I'd just go over one example here. So I want to use a for loop to count the abundance of nucleotides. So I want to see how many A's, how many T's, how many C's, how many G's I have in my sequence. So I have my sequence here. It's 50 base pairs. And I get my length. And now I'm setting, I want to find the counts. And I'm going to save them in variables. And I'm naming them count C, count T, count A, count G. And I'm going to set them equal to 0 at first, because I haven't seen any, I haven't iterated through, so I haven't seen any counts, any characters. I did forget one thing. I just noticed it. I'm going to have this additional count for something that if we hit something that is none of those common nucleotides, then we're just going to throw it into that. Okay, so pretty simple. We want to iterate through our string, and this is how we're going to do it. We first set our variable to 0, and then we go through until we are equal to, and so that we're still less than our length, and then we increment by 1 each time. We find each character. We talked about this above. We grab each character one at a time. And now this is our if statement and an else if statement from the last module. So we want to first check if it's equal to C, else if equal to T, A, and G. And inside of each one, we're just incrementing the count of each respective nucleotide. Pretty straightforward. And anything that isn't a C, T, A, or G, we're just going to put in that count N. And then at the end here, I have the counts printed out. So let's go ahead and see what this does. Haven't run this yet, so I'm not entirely sure it's going to run. But if it doesn't, we'll fix it together. Aha! This did not work. Can you spot the bug? I did. I feel kind of stupid, but it's a good exercise in this. So I wrote this rather quickly, and I've made a fundamental error that I told you guys not to make, but I just made it. So equal equal is not what you use for strings, and we're doing a string comparison. So these all need to be EQ. Duh. Okay, let's run this again. Alright, so that looks a little bit more realistic. So I guess to check, we can look at the A maybe. We have 5 A's. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so, reasonably, I think we did well. I think this is working. so that's a really simple exercise you can do um, to count to this integrates both for loops and if else statements. Don't forget to use EQ for strings, or you'll get very funny results that make no sense. Okay, so that's it for this time. In the next module, we are going to look at file I/O, and for file I/O, while loops are the way to go, and I will show you exactly why I think that and how to open and close files, read from them, and do things with the data. So I hope to see you all next time.